Hello everyone and welcome to another video with me, 320 Sim Pilot, and today we are going to take a look at the Fenix Simulations A320 for Microsoft Flight Simulator. In particular, we are taking a look at their development update. This is not a released product, I do not have access to it. We're just going to be looking at the press release and I'll give you some hopefully extra context on the information that the team and Amir have already given us. So first of all, we're looking at the hydraulics page, and as this is quite topical because I did a video on the hydraulics not too long ago on this channel, so I'll provide a link to that. But as you can see, the page already simulated running quite accurately. But Amir wanted to show us a little bit deeper side of it. So in this next clip, and these are all clips taken out of the videos Amir kindly put together, so I'm just going to talk over a few sort of points that I wanted to talk about as well. So there you go, you get the yellow amber system when the pumps are switched off, which is exactly what we would expect to happen. And then as we go into this clip, what you're going to see is the degradation of the flight controls, and crucially this page, the Ecam status page, is already up and running. Now this is a lot of information. This page will be adjusted according to which failures have happened, and as you can see it says landing distance procedure apply and crucially flaps slow. So this is something that the pilots will use to prepare for the approach. We use that status page, and it doesn't matter how complicated the failure, we can get the information from this page. So it's great to see it already up and running in the Fenix Simulations, and also showing all the correct information for what we would expect. So this is proving to be a serious level of failure management. Now what Amir is going to show us is the slow running of those flaps. So they've simulated the system correctly. They've got the single hydraulic system now because he's turned off the other ones. So it's running on one hydraulic system to power the flaps, and therefore obviously they move slower. Now as we saw in my hydraulics video, the degradation of the Airbus means that you can lose some of the flight control surfaces, i.e. the ailerons or certain roll spoilers. So now Amir shows with what is our first glimpse, I think, of the exterior of the Fenix A320 in Microsoft Flight Simulator. But Amir shows roll with the system degraded, only one hydraulic system, and there you go, you can see just two of the roll spoilers and the ailerons working. So this is going to be a failure that still has the ailerons working, but the correct spoilers are staying down, which is exactly what would happen in the real aircraft. The single hydraulic system failure would probably just fail a few flight control surfaces, but a more serious one could put you into alternate law where you'll have direct control over the roll. It will no longer be at a roll rate as it is in normal law. Nice to see this shot actually. It's been really good to see the Fenix exterior model. We haven't seen too much of it. I do like the angle of this shot as well. It's something I would do, which is to line it up and get the bloom shining off the surfaces at just the right point. So yeah, a very nicely chosen shot. But again, this is showing us that the flaps do actually run slowly like the real aircraft, and this is a common thing in our simulator checks when we have hydraulic faults. The biggest thing in the world, it almost makes no difference having the flaps run slowly, except for the workload on approach. So we have to build that time in, because of course the flaps still travel out, it's totally safe, we can land in a normal way, but we could get rushed into an approach where we're not fully ready for it. Before we continue, I'd like to point out that if you want the in-depth information for any of the clips you're seeing here, please do go to the blog post by Fenix Simulations and Amir, which is available in the link in the description. So do please go to that, it will give you all the information you need. It's a very good technical summary, and I don't actually have a lot to add to it. What I wanted to do here, after requests from you guys that wanted to hear my thoughts on it, I just wanted to give you a little bit of context about maybe how we see this stuff in sim scenarios, things like that. Moving on then onto the next clip, and this is an interesting quirk that Mir actually gave me some information about. It's to do with the leak valves or leak measurement valves in the Airbus and the way they interact. But here he's failed the sensors to show the actual pressure, so the Airbus can't see the pressure, so you get those amber crosses, and now he's turned it back on again. But even while the pressure sensors were turned off, you could see that the airplane had no warnings. It was quite happy, it knew it had hydraulic pressure because it's got other systems that used to tell it that the hydraulic system is up and running, whether or not you can see the pressure displayed. Now that's quite a common thing to happen. It's one of the more common failures, not the hydraulic system particularly, but seeing a sensor failure that doesn't actually have any knock-on effects. Things like fuel temperatures, I've had that where you'll see your fuel temperature rise and rise and rise, and then suddenly it will go into amber crosses as the airplane decides, right, that information is no good, and you realise that it's just a sensor failure. So the Airbus is very good, very clever at working through those different problems, and it's great to see the Fenix has got that up and running with the hydraulic system, and I'm assuming the other systems as well, all to do with that level of detail going into the background systems. It's also interesting to note that as pilots we often see the systems in the Airbus as pretty simplified. We get used to seeing the hydraulic system as a series of green lines on the Ecam or on the overhead panel, but we don't actually take into account how many different valves and pumps and backups and sensors are actually in that system. So we have a very good understanding of how it affects us as pilots, but sometimes those technical details in the background are hidden away, and that's by design. It's because the pilots shouldn't really be worrying about that stuff. They need to know how to solve a problem with the airplane in flight, which isn't going to be a 12-hour in-depth analysis of the hydraulic system. It's going to be a shorter term event, which is why the systems are simplified for our use. But it's great to see the Fenix forcing us to take an appreciation for the level of complexity and backup engineered into the Airbus aircraft. This next clip will be familiar to those of you who've seen my hydraulic video. It's where Amir puts the brakes onto the alternate braking system, and then by failing the yellow hydraulic system, you can show the use of the accumulator. So let's get that clip on the screen, and what you're going to see is in that little pressure gauge you can see the brakes being pumped, which therefore drains the accumulator at the top of that. So that's all functioning just as we would expect, which is great to see. Amir does talk about it in the blog post that this gauge and the hydraulic system has time effect over it. So if you were to leave the airplane parked up overnight, you'd find that accumulator gauge goes down on its own. This is accurate to the real aircraft, the gauge that Amir is just circling there with his mouse. This is accurate to the real aircraft, where that gauge, the accumulator, will gently drain overnight, and then by the time you get to it in the morning, you may need to actually top it up, which you can do using the yellow hydraulic pump, but you have to be very careful. Or often the more common way is that the ground crew will open up one of the cargo doors, and that will run the yellow electric pump, which will repressurize the accumulator, which is something that is modeled in the Fenix as well, and Amir has shown us already, which I believe is going to be in this clip. So that accumulator can run out of pressure overnight. A lot of airlines, in fact all airlines, will chock the aircraft. So you don't leave aircraft like a car where they're just using the parking brake. You actually put chocks in case the parking brake releases or the hydraulic system loses pressure. So for the exact reason, as we're seeing, that pressure can fade over time, so that the chocks will take the strain. And some airlines will actually turn off the parking brake overnight and leave the aircraft resting on the chocks. That's quite common. So there you go, there are different ways. But here you go, the yellow electric pump has run because the cargo door was opened through the MCDU. Great to see that MCDU interaction, by the way, and it powers up. Now in my experience, the yellow pump runs a bit longer than that, but I'll have to take a closer look at that next time I see it at work, because I can't be 100% sure. Amir talks about a blip or a surge, but I think it runs continuously for a little while the door is operating. The door we're talking about is the cargo door. The ground crew operate that, and it will run the yellow electric pump to power that door, but it won't run the PTU when that happens, the power transfer unit. Again, my hydraulic video talks a little bit more about this, but it's so good to see all this interaction and these systems talking to each other correctly in the Fenix at this point. Now this next clip is showing the hydraulic level indicator. So on the Ecam we can see the hydraulic levels, and we want them to be in that green band. Amir talks about this in his video very well, but I just was really excited to see this, so I couldn't resist showing you the clip. What's going on here is when Amir raises the landing gear, you'll see that the green hydraulic fluid quantity reduces, and that is true in the real aircraft. I've talked about this quite a bit on streams actually. When I do my systems check at the top of Climb, I often go to the hydraulics page, and so many times, I mean my viewers are probably bored of hearing it, I say, oh well, the hydraulic levels wouldn't all be the same, because in a lot of sims they tend to all show exactly the same number. But this is more likely what you'll see. It's quite alarming at first when you first come onto the Airbus as an aircraft, when you first start flying it, because you think, oh no, we've lost hydraulic fluid, it's disappeared, it's below the green band. But that green band is what we use on the ground when we're setting up the aircraft to check it's all in good shape. What it's actually doing is, and Amir explains it very well in the video, is that fluid is being used in the landing gear to be pushed into the cylinder to push the landing gear up, so it just gets moved around and it gets taken out of the reservoir. You'll see it's totally fine. A side note on these gauges is that sometimes you can actually find that the arrow is above the green band, so you can almost have too much hydraulic fluid. Very, very occasionally that does happen, and it can be, again, a little bit disconcerting until you're used to what you're looking for. Now we're going to take a look at another failure that Amir sets up in a video. His video is talking about hydraulics at this point, but I want to talk about the Ecam. So in this you can see Amir turns off the blue system, the PTU and the green system, so the airplane's flying on just the yellow, and the airplane will fly on just the yellow system. But regardless of that, you see that Ecam, and it's great to see this modelled so correctly. We've got the bright red Ecam. This is because it's a complex failure. You've got land base up in red on the right, and you see that little green arrow just below the or in the middle of the Ecam on the top screen, and there's another arrow on the status page. See all those failures listed there. As I said earlier, that status page, incredibly useful to us as pilots, and what it's doing is there's so much information on it when you have a failure of that complexity that there's an arrow to tell you you need to actually scroll to the next page, which we do by repressing the status button. So yeah, it's all simulated. We've got the huge amount of information. As I said, that's an incredibly flexible page, that status page, but it will give us the clues that we need to solve the problem of getting the airplane safely on the ground. The Ecam instructions are what we do to sort of complete the failure and secure the airplane, and then we can move on to the Ecam status page to actually work out how we're going to fly the approach. Leading on from that complex failure, Amir does the natural progression, which is to show us the flight control degradation that you have at this point. So the airplane, as I said earlier, will fly on one hydraulic system, and I don't need to talk to you about hydraulics because hopefully you've seen the blog post already or the videos originally, so that should be the place to get some good information on it. But here you go, another outside shot of the Fenix A320, which I really like. I'm really enjoying the textures on those wings, the different shades of metal and paint that you get on the middle part of the wing and the flight control surfaces. I absolutely love it, and it's not something I've seen done so well. So that is really, really nice. The visual model looks great. And as you can see, those two spoilers moving up and down, creating a lower roll rate. So that seems to be a good sign that the flight model is coming along. Also, one elevator working, which is exactly the thing I showed in my hydraulic video using the Toliss in X-Plane actually. So yeah, it's great to see it all functioning here. Again, at this early stage, it's a great thing. As you can see, the airplane rolled slightly because the one elevator running on one side will obviously have that secondary effect when you're not in normal law. Next, I've got a couple of clips from the rundown on the fuel system. So this first part is very interesting. It's something I haven't seen much of. It's not talked about much, but it is a procedure that we have. And basically, it is covering what to do if turning off the engine master switch doesn't actually shut down the engine. So to simulate this, Amir does I believe it's a DC essential fault, and you can see on that lower electrical page, the electrical page seems to be pretty much fully functional already as well. You've got the amber DC essential bus bar, and you've lost certain things like the standby instruments, the ISIS screen, and a few other things that we're used to having. And he's turned off the engine masters, but because they're not, or they go off, but they're not connected to anything, and they must be run through the DC essential bus bar, which means that now they are not going to actually turn off the engine. The engine has obviously two valves for the fuel, and again, Amir talks about this in his video very well. And basically, if you turn off the low pressure valve, you'll actually have some fuel still circulating through the engine initially, and it will take time for that to run dry. So to shut down the engine in this case, you'll actually have to use the fire push button. Now, it was really good to see this, and here goes Amir showing that, by the way, on the screen. But yeah, it's great to see this because it's something that we don't really talk about much on the Airbus, but it's a little known procedure just sitting there in the background. It's in the QRH, ready for use if we need to turn off the engine like this. Having the engines running on stand is a very risky business. It's not something you want, and it could be incredibly dangerous. So there are a lot of procedures, and basically, of course, no one's going to come to the airplane until those engines are shut down. So you need a way to turn them off, and the engine fire push button is designed to be a last-ditch resort to just seal that engine from fuel and other things that could potentially make the situation worse. So that's all been simulated, and that's a testament to the valves and fluid systems that seem to be implemented in this version of the A320. Fenix have been very proud of their simulation of these systems, especially, as I say, the valves. So it's great to have those all put in the right place, and then the fuel coherently flowing through them. As you can see in that clip, there is a bit of a delay as the fuel circulates through the engine until it finally runs out. The last clip we're going to look at today then is talking about the fuel heat exchange system. In the Airbus, the cold fuel is actually passed through the heat exchanger with the IDG oil. The IDG is the integrated drive generator. It is what we use to power the generators on the Airbus. Basically, the oil in those generators gets very hot because it's a very high spinning, high RPM part, and that therefore benefits from being cooled down a bit to keep the temperature under control. The fuel, on the flip side of that, is very cold. It sits in the wings. The air temperature outside up in the cruise can be below -50 degrees Celsius very easily, and that fuel gets very cold. We don't want the fuel getting too cold because eventually it will start to wax, it's called, where it starts to go too solid and is no good, and we don't want that at all going near our engines. So the Airbus has quite a neat way of combining the two. It's quite common in jet airliners. What happens is the fuel is passed through a heat exchanger with the oil from the IDG. That way the warm oil is cooled down and the cold fuel is warmed up. So in this next clip, which is coming onto the screen now, Amir talks us through that and shows that the system is functioning, which is great because I've been longing for a proper temperature system in the fuel Airbuses in flight simulators that I've been using over the last sort of couple of years. So as you can see, the outer tanks are flowing into the inner tanks in the clip Amir shows. That's because he's put not much fuel on, and therefore the fuel is flowing from the outers to the inners. But for the first part of the flight, the fuel in the outer tanks actually stays there. You'll have about 700 kilos in both of those outer tanks at the edge of the wings, and then you'll have more in the inner tanks that will drain down eventually to a point, and then the outer tanks drain into the inner tank. But as you can see with that little arrow, the valves are already open in the clip that we're seeing. So again, it's great to see all of this stuff simulated. But there's a high IDG temperature, and Amir shows us that that high temperature translates into hotter fuel going into those outer tanks as part of that fuel exchanger. Because what's happening is the exchanger sends some of that fuel that isn't going to be used, so it's fuel that's being sent towards the engine, it's being warmed up, but if it's not going to be used, it gets fed back into that outer tank. So it heats up the outer tank first, and then by the default obviously eventually heats up the inner tank. This is an interesting thing because on the Neos it's actually noticeable that, to me anyway, that this outer tank does not get heated up as much. There seems to be a difference in the amount of temperature exchange on the Neo aircraft. I don't know why. I have asked, but I don't know why. But anyway, this is the CEO we're talking about today. So this is nice because what happens is the fuel, if it's really cold in winter, when you land with ice cold fuel in the wings, if you've got too much, you might start to get frost on the top of the wings. The great thing about this system is that as you start your descent, hopefully those valves open and the warm fuel in those outer tanks that's been warmed by that IDG eventually drains into the inner tanks and actually brings the average temperature up, which helps that wing warm up slightly and maybe avoid the risk of ice. Not always, it's just one of those things that sometimes helps out, but it's something we do look at, and it's an effect that is noticeable. So it's great to see it noticeable here where they've actually modelled the temperature and the fuel heat exchanging going on. So really, really nice to see that, and I'm very happy to see that make its way into a simulator. Amir does talk about it in the blog post, of course, so please do read that. But there is an effect that can happen, which is if you sit at idle power for long enough on the ground in somewhere that's very warm, you'll have warm fuel in the fuel tanks. There's the cat on cue. You'll have warm fuel in the fuel tanks, and then you'll have the engine circulating that warm fuel from the IDG back into the outer tanks. Now you'd think eventually, of course, it would run out of space, but it actually drains over gently throughout the flight into the inner tanks anyway. The thing that happens is that the fuel can just continuously heat itself up because it's obviously getting pumped warm fuel in, and then you can get a warning. Rare, I haven't seen that much, but I don't operate in very hot parts of the world, as you guys know. I'm in Europe, and I spend a lot of that time near the UK, so I don't see that effect very often. I'm more likely to see the cold effect, where it's quite handy having that system warm up the fuel, and you notice that mostly in the descent. But there we go. So that's all for today's video. Something slightly different again. They were mostly video clips shown with this press release, so I wanted to just give you a bit of my thoughts on some of those clips. There's loads more information in the blog post, so please do go and read that. Watch the full videos that Amir's provided. They'll teach you loads about the systems, and we'll be, of course, looking more in detail at this once we actually get the chance. I do apologise about the cat. She's not letting me get away with it today. So yeah, definitely worth checking that post out. I hope you're interested in the updates to the Fenix and just seeing some of these additional systems. Do leave your thoughts in the comments if you are or are not interested, but it got very well received last time, and I had a lot of people asking me my thoughts on this latest update, so I thought I'd make this little video. I can only apologise there's a DC6 on screen, but I just thought that would make a nice B-roll footage in the background. So there'll be plenty more live streams, guides, tutorials. We've got some A320X updates coming soon as well, so do please stay tuned to the channel and subscribe if you would like to see more of that. Otherwise, we'll see you again in another of those videos or live streams very soon. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.